esteemed host, Misha Appel.
Hi, everyone. Happy that you all were able to make it, other than all the lovely weather issues that we've all had, but glad you're all safe and here to join us on this exciting talk. So I'm going to do a little introduction on Daniel, and then he's going to take it away, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end. So Daniel's a PhD student at the Center for Criminology and Sociological Studies. Was that right? Socio-legal studies. I should know that. I'm in law school.
That's totally right.
Socio-legal studies, and a graduate affiliate at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. He is interested in the intersection of criminology and science and technology studies, with an emphasis on police technologies, big data surveillance, and predictive justice. Daniel's worked on a number of interdisciplinary projects on topics such as serial homicide, cannabis law, and the organizational behavior of robbery teams. Prior to his PhD, Daniel volunteered for the John Howard Society's Center of Research, Policy, and Program Development, where he assisted with projects on bail reform and police record checks. When he's not teaching or researching, Daniel likes to play guitar, make cocktails, read fiction, walk his dog, or have a cozy evening in front of the TV with the cantor's daughter, Rebecca, who's also here today. So yeah, Daniel, please take it away. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Misha. I appreciate it. So I'm going to share my screen, and I apologize. First off, I'm a little bit nasally. I'm getting over a head cold. And I'm going to be flitting between PowerPoint and my face. So I don't know, if my face just pops up, don't be alarmed. But I'm going to try my best. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Okay, sweet. And if at any point you have a question, please interrupt me. I would love nothing more than to be interrupted and to clarify. I'm constantly trying to explain what I do or what I'm interested in. And I realize that sometimes academics can get a little caught up in explaining concepts not all too clearly. So I'm going to try to fix that. I'm not going to solve that today. That's a bigger problem, but all to say, I'm going to be talking about policing and technology. So police surveillance, as well as the increasingly tech-savvy way in which police do so, is one of the most pressing issues in modern life. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in the midst of a PhD studying it. When it comes to policing, surveillance and technologies have done quite a good job of capturing the public imagination. And there's this tendency for us to kind of filter our ideas of police technology and surveillance through popular media. It's almost a trope at this point for us to compare new police technologies to the Steven Spielberg movie Minority Report, or to reference George Orwell's book 1984 when talking about the new surveillance society and the big brother that watches over it. But what these fictionalized accounts of police tech and surveillance gloss over is the actual social consequence these technologies can bring to bear. Sure, 1984 does talk about the loss of free will under authoritarian rule, and Minority Report definitely talks about future murder, but what I'm talking about is a little more subtle than that. So the main idea that I want to convey in this talk is a simple one. Police technologies seem like these handy solutions to problems, and they have this appearance of legitimacy and objectivity. But in plenty of cases, these technologies also reaffirm pretty significant human biases. This is what Gary T. Marks, no relation to Carl, professor emeritus at MIT and frankly a real hotshot surveillance scholar, refers to as the, quote, magisterial legitimacy granting aura of police and surveillance technology. This aura comes from these technologies' positions at the intersection of law and science, disciplines, which I'm sure Misha can also attest to, operate at a bit of a distance. They're governed by rules and standardization. They're rational, they're impersonal, and they each even have their own highly structured languages that make them seem rigid and detached and therefore a little more credible. So many of these technologies come with larger than life promises of being a silver bullet solution to all sorts of human problems, but the fixes that they provide either create new problems for people or worsen problems that already existed in the first place. So before we dive in, I just wanted to lay out a little roadmap for today so that we're all on the same page, and feel free to interject at any point while I address these subjects if anything is still unclear. So first we'll talk about the history of police technology. It'll be very, very surface level. Then we'll talk about the knowledge, the basis of police work, which is fundamentally it's a knowledge profession. We'll get into a little bit about big data, about algorithms, and how those factor into policing. We'll talk about predictive policing, how it works and why it's a little bit controversial. And then we'll end off with a little chat about the Canadian context. So a very brief, totally incomplete history of some police technologies. Basically, policing as we know it today, professionalized, formalized, and organized, didn't really begin until 1829 in London under this dude named Sir Robert Peel. As far back as those early days, the police have long been infatuated with technological innovations. Since they first adopted uniforms, patrol wagons, and call boxes, technology has played a crucial role in the development of law enforcement and has, for better or worse, revolutionized police practice and organization. One of the first technological innovations that fundamentally changed the way police operate was the advent of the telephone, as well as the two-way radio and the automobile. Before these modern technologies existed, the public had to search the streets for a policeman or pay a visit to a local police station. Supervision of cops was also a whole to-do, as supervising officers had to arrange to meet their employees in person in order to pass info onto them. Officers, meanwhile, patrolled their beat alone, cut off from headquarters with little chance of assistance should the perils of the street demand it. The invention and implementation of the phone and the two-way radio basically changed all of that. It allowed the police and the public to communicate with each other much more effectively and for police to respond to dispatch calls much quicker. And as American cities began to modernize and expand, and as cars became a popular and efficient mode of urban transportation, way back when, foot patrols grew all the more irrelevant, leading police departments to outfit officers with radio-equipped cars, seen as a benefit at the time for more efficient, effective, and responsive law enforcement. Now there's a shift, well, not now, but over the past 40 years, there's been a shift away from vehicular patrol towards community policing in order to establish a closer connection with the community, but that's neither here nor there. So fast forward, and I'm going to share my screen once more. Well, I mean, I will keep, I'm so far killing it on this flitting front. Fast forward to 1967. President Lyndon B. Johnson has set up what was called the U.S. President's Commission on Law and Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, or more casually, the Crime Commission. Here are maybe 2 out of 3 nice Jewish boys, no idea. The commission publishes a big fat report called The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society. And this report features all their major findings that they drew over their examination of, quote, every facet of crime and law enforcement in America. Buried near the end of the report's 13 chapters, though, is this brief 20-page section called Science and Technology, where it discusses the potential that computers could have for policing. Mind you, this is 1967. Here, the commission seemed optimistic about computers, given the enormous quantities of data criminal justice agencies were entrusted with handling. Advocates for this felt that computers would allow for faster processing of information, that it would expand police productivity and capability, and that it would improve law enforcement services overall by, say, shortening their response time to calls for service. Some even thought that introducing the computer to policing could improve arrest rates, deter criminal activity, and also reduce crime rates. And so these 2 government agencies were born. Their names don't really matter at all, but their main jobs were to administer funding for state and local law enforcement agencies to spearhead the computerization of policing. The changes were significant, although a little bit slow. It seemed that only the most routine and manual activities of policing, stuff that required a lot of busy work, that was repetitive, that involved a lot of looking through databases, those were the ones that found the greatest improvement with the introduction of the computer. Other police tasks that mostly involved a lot of human decision-making were the ones that had more mixed success, largely because computer power hadn't really reached its full potential at that point, but because those behind the scene tasks were most dependent on the human judgment. These tasks proved tricky to automate because they couldn't quite replace the human element in very human practices. So fast forward about 20 or 30 years, and things seem to pick back up. In 1998, the US enacts this act called the National Crime Identification Technology Act, a little bit of a mouthful, which created this fund of about $250 million to help states in the United States improve their police technology infrastructure. But after 9/11, the focus of this funding shifted toward bankrolling counterterrorism efforts, including these things called fusion centers, which were used to sort of link up all these different federal agencies to make sure that everyone was communicating with one another. Sorry. Still, they were ultimately shown that after 9/11, and after the efforts to after counterterrorism efforts I wouldn't say fell out of vogue, but became less pressing as the 2000s sort of progressed, these fusion centers, now with less to do, started becoming adopted by police, who now had this really technologically advanced infrastructure for approaching crime prevention and detection, things that are a little lower level than counterterrorism. So from here, the history of police tech gets a bit foggier due to the secret nature with which most of these technologies are bought and used. We'll get more into that whole secret thing later, but basically what we do know is that one of the biggest developments was predictive policing. And that's really going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. It was created by this ex-police chief named William J. Bratton, and he collaborated with the Los Angeles Police Department. He basically just had the idea, what if we took policing and blended it with predictive analytics? Predictive analytics being the use of historical facts to make predictions about future events. Police departments in a few notable cities in America like Chicago, Boston, LA, New York, DC, they all expressed interest in piloting these predictive policing programs. And by 2010, there were a bunch of companies that were making the software. How all of this history maps onto police technology in Canada is also a little unclear. But most of the tools that police in the US use find a way of creeping north through technology conferences, trade shows, and word of mouth between police upper brass. Still, we'll dive a little bit into the specifics of the Canadian context later on. But for now, let's get into the tech and what sort of lies beneath it. Before I do, are there any questions? How interactive are we going to make this? I have no idea. Okay. All right, I will just keep moving along. So what makes police technology so interesting to me, at least, and hopefully what makes it somewhat less than boring for you, is that police technology, as I look at it, or as I really focus in my studies, deals with information and knowledge. And actually, this is quite consistent with what policing is in itself. Most of policing is not guns a-blazing crime fighting, but actually something called knowledge work. Policing involves a lot of gathering info, producing information, sharing information. It's mostly talking. It's talking to victims, lawyers, other officers, confidential informants, witnesses, and so on. Within police culture, which is a whole other thing that I won't even get into, knowledge work has been somewhat feminized. We've often heard policing referred to as a boys' club, and that's not exactly untrue. And research has really found that officers look down on knowledge work as quote unquote not real policing. To them, knowledge work is busy work, it's admin work, and it's less valuable to them than what they call hard charging law enforcement. But frankly, this is quite misleading. Knowledge work just so happens to be extremely important to the way that police function. Criminal investigation, after all, it's really just information processing. A lot of the ways in which police go about producing and processing knowledge nowadays, though, is underpinned by scientific, technological methods, meaning that knowledge and technology interact in some pretty interesting ways. And a lot of this knowledge and information has come to be associated with the term big data. All right. Are we all familiar with big data? I feel like I'm just pelting like concept after concept and just kind of blazing full steam ahead.
What do you, when you're using that term, Daniel?
Oh, I'm about to describe it, but believe you me, this is the interactive portion of the, what do we, is anyone familiar with big data? No. Okay, this is great because I've written so much about this that I'm just going to spew right now. So basically, I'm going to pull up my slides once more. what is big data? Well, first off, what is data, right? Data is basically just bits of information, statistics or facts, which are then used to make decisions or calculations. Just by existing in this world with a phone, for example, or interacting with going online, shopping, going to the store and using your credit card, all of these activities generate data, little bits of information about you and your habits, what you buy, what you like to do, where you go, things of that nature. But big data refers both to very large data sets, which are very vast and complex, and that traditional processing applications are just unable to handle, as well as the tools used to manipulate and analyze these digital breadcrumbs that you leave around just by simply existing in this digital world. The tools often used to manipulate data are run by algorithms. An algorithm is really just a sequence of instructions used to solve a problem. As well as artificial intelligence, which in a word is a computer's ability to perform tasks usually performed by human beings. The concept of big data doesn't just refer to gathered info. The term big data also refers to the motivations behind what harvesting that info is supposed to achieve. When data is collected en masse and algorithms, these bad boys right here, cross-reference data both within and between data sets, the computers that the data identifies, they'll find patterns within them. They'll look at all of the different bits of digital information about you and say, this person was here and this person spent this money, spent money at like this grocery store, then perhaps these are their shopping habits. This is where they go throughout the day, this sort of thing like that. Big data also carries business connotations, referring to how personal information has been commodified, or how our data is bought, tracked, sold, and traded among data brokers, which is something that you usually see if you've ever gotten a targeted ad. The fact that you've bought something on Amazon, for example, generates data that you like, I don't know, this particular brand of dog food, and then you see that ad for that brand of dog food later on in the day. That information is very valuable because it tells companies about you just by your internet habits. So more than anything, beyond big data, meaning the actual technology, meaning the motivations behind gathering this information in the first place, more than the business aspect of having all of this information, big data comes with this belief. It's the sort of larger than life mythical power that more data is better. Big data comes with its own belief in its own power, that having more data can lead to greater insights we never thought of before. It also comes with this sort of objective idea that the numbers don't lie. And as we'll soon see, this belief that big data will save us is something that isn't always the case when it comes to police technology. So now we're getting into the good stuff. Big data has been a key feature of predictive policing. Policing is a traditionally reactive enterprise, with officers responding to service calls as situations demand it. When police rely on big data and predictive technologies, however, their policing becomes more proactive, sometimes aggressively so. Police departments, mostly in the US, but more so in Canada, can choose from a wide variety of predictive policing software packages available on the market, which each take into account a bunch of different factors to make their predictions. So here's a little video that breaks down a couple of the more popular predictive policing softwares. I'm going to switch to a different share. I'm gonna do a new share. How fun is that? Okay, I hope that, I might have to actually enable my sound. Yeah, share sound. There we go. I've done this before, I swear. Okie doke.
People have been drawing maps since the early 1800s to try and understand where and when crime happens, in the hopes of better predicting where and when it will happen again. Today's crime maps are made by computers and fed by detailed crime data. Police departments routinely scan their precincts for hotspots, places experiencing a disproportionate amount of criminal activity. With the help of these maps, many departments simply put cops on the dots in order to prevent future crimes. This hotspot analysis has become more sophisticated, leading to predictive policing. Most predictive policing begins with a grid, dividing a city into squares that can be as small as half a block. Beginning with data of previous crimes, computer programs create a forecast for each square. estimating the risk of a crime occurring there during a precinct's next 4-hour shift. But beyond that, predictive policing systems differ in their approaches. PredPol was one of the first predictive policing tools on the market, and its forecasts are based solely on crime data, what kind of crime happened, where, and when. It builds on techniques for forecasting earthquakes, with the aftershocks of a crime reverberating across the city's grid. Then there's risk terrain modeling, which draws on the same basic crime data as well as features of the city, like proximity to a public transportation hub, a collection of bars, the current weather, or even the phases of the moon. HunchLab uses the same advanced factors as risk terrain modeling and adds a learning algorithm, a tree-based technique for assigning risk to grid cells. You can think of this like a game of 20 questions. Have there been complaints about disorderly conduct nearby recently? Is there a concentration of bars or liquor stores nearby? Is there a subway stop nearby? Answering each question sends you down a different branch of the tree, the end of the process being a risk value. Ultimately, HunchLab creates hundreds of these trees and combines them into a forest to create a robust forecasting tool. Will we ever really be able to predict crimes before they happen? Maybe not. But even the idea prompts important questions about how we manage police resources.
Should I have just shown that video at the outset and then left? Maybe. Probably would have more effectively conveyed all of this. So as the video shows, there are a couple different approaches to predictive policing. Ignore the whole forest and trees thing, but what that is talking about is location-based predictive policing programs. The basis for this location-based predictive policing is something called hotspots policing. Hotspots policing is a philosophy of policing in which police deploy greater resources to certain areas where crime is supposedly most concentrated. Like hotspots policing, predictive policing employs a variety of variables to identify specific areas in which future crime is most likely to happen. As we saw, it crunches large swaths of data from diverse sources, looking at data on places, events, historical crime rates, to uncover patterns in criminal behavior and develop maps of where different types of offenses are most clustered. From there, departments deploy officers to areas that algorithms have flagged as high risk. In other words, and this is really what it all boils down to, location-based predictive policing literally changes where police go. On top of helping police target particular neighborhoods or areas, predictive policing technologies can also focus on specific people. These programs tend to look at a lot of personal and social information, like your age, your gender, your marital status, whether you have a history of substance abuse, do you have a criminal record, and so on. So police can direct their resources towards individuals. One example of this happened in Chicago a few years ago, and it was a project called the Strategic Subjects List. The Strategic Subjects List was a technology that generated a person's risk score based on their past criminal history, arrests, parole status, if they were affiliated with a gang, and if they had social ties to other victims of murder. This technology allowed the police to identify individuals who were most likely to be involved in a shooting, either as a victim or as a perpetrator. Police would then use this information to hand out custom notification letters to the people on their heat list, as it was colloquially called. Police would literally go to their house to speak with them directly or slip a notice under their door, warning them about their future as either a victim or perpetrator of gun violence, and offering violence prevention services. So kind of freaky, if you ask me, since it's basically letting people know that they're being watched. But of course, this all takes on new meaning when we look at it through race. As we've discussed, some believe that police technology comes with this promise, a promise to make policing fairer and more neutral, more responsive to citizens' needs, and thus more democratic. And some believe this about predictive policing. How could impartial police data be biased? How could software, how could the computer make racist decisions if it's simply telling police where to go? Can numbers like these lie? Predictive policing is seen as a means of making police more precise. And the academic writing about this technology talks about how police departments view predictive tools as improving police performance and adding greater value to service delivery, but what some view as helpful, others view as repressive. Some academics call it tech washing and masking inequality. Others call it the new Jim Code. the appearance of a technology being neutral that hides more deep-rooted police biases and creates the impression that these police tools are, unlike the humans who use them, objective. So let's dig into a more tangible example. There's this scholar named Sarah Brain who did this really deep study of how the Los Angeles Police Department uses big data analytics to inform their policing. The main point that Sarah Brain makes is that predictive policing is caught in what she calls a racialized feedback loop of its own making. Predictive models of policing need data. The prediction algorithms learn from that data. But if that data itself is compiled by a police force that racially profiles minorities, the computer will learn to make predictions that just reproduce the data it got, thereby upholding the racial bias of the officers who generated that data. So let's see how this feedback loop plays out. I'm going to share my screen once again, maybe for a little bit longer. I got to speed right up. I had all these nice slides that I totally missed. So as part of Operation Laser, which stands for Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration, I don't really know exactly why it's called that, Los Angeles police officers are informed of a problem crime in a particular division. They're then instructed to gather intelligence on their patrols by stopping suspected people and having them fill out something called a field interview card. Here's a picture of a field interview card. You can, if you squint, you'll be able to see what sort of things they're asking. They fill out the card with a ton of personal information and then enter that personal info into the predictive policing program. Based on the gathered information and level of danger that they've associated with certain bits of that personal information, the people the police stop are then each assigned a point value and given a numerical rank. The more personal information that police deem risky, the higher number you'll get. This number system, however, creates a sort of cycle. Having a high point value is a predictor of future police contact, but each police contact further drives up the individual's point value because they've had an interaction with the police. If officers are driven to disproportionately stop people of color or individuals in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and if someone gets a point for every time they're stopped by the cops, then those with the greatest likelihood of being stopped again are simply those who have been stopped before, regardless of whether they've done anything wrong. Thus, predictive policing technologies run the risk of continually disfavoring the most vulnerable of populations, subjecting members of predominantly poor and urban communities to more and more scrutiny, regardless of what they're doing or what they've done. This sets the stage for us to take a critical look at police technologies like predictive policing. Many academics have been asking a fundamental question: does predictive policing even work? According to some, there's no way of proving that it does, and that it might just be shifting crime from one area to another. And this could be because of many things. This could be because of bad quality data, as we've just discussed. It could be because of an algorithm that is broken, or it could be because of poor human supervision, or any sort of combination of any of those. Others have raised similar worries about the supposed efficiency and effectiveness of predictive policing. Predictive policing, so it goes, does not offer problem-oriented responses to policing. These tools simply send police patrols to certain places based on predictive analyses, but doesn't really tailor or adjust policing strategies to certain locations, right? It's basically cookie cutter. And it means that officers, oh, is someone unmuted? Do I need to be stern? That's okay. It basically just means that there's this sort of cookie cutter reaction that predictive policing technologies create. Officers are going to a crime hotspot, but they're not really dealing with what's happening in that crime hotspot in a way that is tailored to what that area might actually need. This also means that it's allowing them to get to a place more efficiently, but the place that they're being sent to might be wrong. Simon Cole, a writer on forensic investigation, says that when it comes to policing, computers are fast but dumb. What good is speed if it comes at the expense of accuracy? And this is true in another context too, which is criminal courts. We're going to just shift a little bit for a moment. In North America, some courts have started using the software called COMPASS, which stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for alternative sanctions. Sounds very serious. KONIKOFF is a risk assessment tool that generates a risk score based on a defendant's responses to 137 questions on a survey. This survey screens for a whole lot of different variables like criminal history, whether they have a stable place to live, their education, their job, what they do for fun, are they socially isolated? From these responses, defendants are then assigned a score between 1 and 10, with the higher number suggesting a greater likelihood that they will engage in crime again. But pun absolutely intended, the jury is still out on KONIKOFF. One study, for example, found that KONIKOFF is less accurate than humans in predicting a defendant's likelihood of reoffending. So bringing this faster isn't always better thinking back to policing. Police rely on big data. They may have greater access to information about the citizens they're sworn to protect, but that information might not be correct or it might be outdated. Police responding to a 911 call at a certain house, for example, may be notified by a quick database check that the occupants of that house have a criminal record. A notification, though, that may no longer hold true if officers only have access to old housing records and if the people who live there have since moved out. Furthermore, predictive policing programs that pin a greater likelihood of crime to a specific geographical area, create problems for what some call surveillance discretion, or the police's ability to decide who to stop and who to watch. This leads us to some interesting questions. Do decisions made by software justify police activities like stop and frisks? Would a higher likelihood of a certain type of offense occurring in a flagged city block at this such and such a time qualify as enough of a reason for an officer to be appropriately suspicious of a certain person? And should that have any bearing on the police's ability to stop that specific person, even if they've only been told that something will happen in that general area and not with that specific person? Individuals living in an area that a predictive program has deemed high crime are kind of afforded less protections. By simply living inside an area a program has labeled a hotspot, individuals might fall prey to this sort of general suspicion. Decisions here become based on a category that they fall into, rather than how they're individually behaving. This can be a bit dehumanizing, frankly. One of the problems with big data is its tendency to view people not as complex beings, but rather as parts of categories. Predictive software analyzes individual data against other individuals that are similar to you, and uses these comparisons to make decisions, identify patterns, and see how individuals align with the broader category in which they've been lumped. So if you bought that dog food, someone else who's bought that dog food may have bought something else, like, I don't know, a poop scoop or any other sort of adjacent dog tool. And then you might get a suggestion to buy that similar tool simply because you have a similar buying pattern to another person. Or you fit into this other group of a large sum of people who often buy these things together. This poses a particular problem for risk assessment tools like the strategic subject list that I mentioned earlier, which targets individuals who are at risk of being a victim or perpetrator of gun violence. They may say that they take into account relevant variables about a given offender, but they ultimately make decisions on that person compared to others, rather than on what that individual has specifically done. Such a consequence may resonate more with select minorities who may be deemed more risk-prone because of their algorithmic alignment with a category already written off as risky or dangerous. And while we're talking about categorization, we may as well talk about the problem of correlation too. Let me just get this going. Correlation means the relation between two or more phenomena. Because of the vastness and depth of big data, the decisions that predictive police technologies can make also have the chance of being entirely misguided. One of the great myths of big data is that more is better. So we mentioned at the beginning, the belief that with more data, we can identify more patterns and solve more of the world's problems. But what big data calls identifying patterns is what most statisticians call merely drawing correlations, which are oftentimes, as you can see here in this little chart of number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and films Nicolas Cage has appeared in, the numbers kind of match up. So is there any sort of meaningful connection between those two? I certainly hope not, and I frankly don't think so. But what looks like a meaningful connection, frankly, is irrelevant. If not assessed with a critical eye, the algorithms used in police technologies, as well as tools used by judges, as we mentioned before with Compass, and prisons, can be used to draw correlations that simply don't mean anything and make life-altering decisions for people based on coincidental statistical relationship. And even if we wanted to get into the guts of these technologies and figure out what's going on with them, a lot of the times we just can't. The algorithms used in criminal justice decision-making remain the property of the private companies that build them. Software companies usually prevent outsiders from opening up the black box of predictive algorithms under the guise of protecting their intellectual property. However, without cracking these black boxes open, it's difficult to discern how these algorithms actually work. Neither the governments who buy them, the cops who use them, or the people on whom they're used really know how they function. Not only does this raise questions regarding transparency, but it also threatens procedural justice. If we don't know how these algorithms crunch the data they're fed, it may be more difficult to say with certainty whether these algorithms are themselves actually as fair as they're supposed to be. And perhaps most importantly, predictive policing tools are often reductionist. They gloss over the material histories and the social relations and the structural conditions that have historically criminalized populations of color and the impoverished places in which they live. And instead, the people who live in these spaces that are drawn up as these crime-ridden hotspots essentially become policeable dots on a digital map, geocoded criminal subjects, faceless objects of state power simply because of where they live. So what does this all mean for Canada? This is not my finest slide, by the way. I was in a bit of a hurry, but what's the nature of the police technology complex here? The thing is, we're still kind of in the process of figuring it out. And by we, I mean me, the only person who's doing this. I'm joking, I'm sure there are plenty of others, but this is basically the main thing I'm looking into in my dissertation. And it's been something that's been tricky to tease apart because of how close-lipped police departments are about technology, as well as how challenging it is to actually access information about these technological projects that are otherwise kept secret. Unfortunately, this has led to both a lack of awareness and scholarship regarding how this technology is being employed across Canadian police departments. Journalists have reported that cities like Vancouver in BC, Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, and London, Ontario, have adopted predictive policing software within the last decade. The Toronto Police has also had a partnership with two different technology companies, IBM and Environics Analytics, and apparently contracted use of their respective crime prediction software. But as of a few years ago, at least, Toronto's denied using predictive policing tools, and I'm having a very hard time getting in touch with the Toronto Police, so I can't verify it myself. Attention was also drawn a few years back to this thing called Project Wide Awake, which just sounds sinister flat out. They should have named it something else, which was an RCMP-led operation involving wide-scale monitoring of individuals' social media activity in Canada. The initiative began at least 6 years ago as a reactive measure designed to help the Mounties analyze social media accounts linked to specific criminal investigations. Since then, the project has shifted toward a more proactive use, as the RCMP has started scouring social media to identify crimes in progress or to stop planned offenses before they occur. The last thing I want to mention before I go, and the sort of latest technology to enter the public conversation, is facial recognition software. Facial recognition systems can take a digital image or a frame from a video featuring a human face, and then match that face against a bigger database of faces. A database of faces. Wow, what a mouthful. Facial recognition software already very much exists to tag friends on Facebook, as you might do, or open your phone. But a handful of tech giants, namely Amazon, had been in the business of marketing and selling their facial recognition to police departments, which police were using to identify missing persons and unknown assailants, and as they say, otherwise speed up the investigation process. But in light of the death of George Floyd, companies like Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft either put a moratorium on selling facial recognition software to police or committed publicly to not selling to police altogether. But in 2019 and 2020, it was found that members of the Toronto Police, as well as members of the RCMP, had been using facial recognition software created by a controversial company called Clearview AI and that they had been using it without the knowledge or approval of their superiors. The reason that Clearview AI is so controversial is because they maintain a database of more than 3 billion images scraped from the internet without people's consent. Unfortunately, whether you have a Facebook account or not, if there's an image of you out there on the internet, it has probably been swooped up in Clearview AI's database. Facial recognition is also famously finicky. Clearview AI as well, but others created by other companies. Joy Buolamwini, who is a researcher at MIT, published a really notable study about how facial recognition software has a harder time and has a higher error rate when assessing darker skinned faces. Because, as we talked about earlier with predictive policing, it's trained on data predominantly of white faces. You can see how this can be a problem if the tech is put in the hands of police, and this could have disastrous consequences for racial minorities who are already the subject of disproportionate police attention anyway. I realize that we are low on time, so I will wrap this up. I'm happy to answer any questions afterward about the current controversies in Canada with facial recognition, because I realized that I pretty much just sort of glazed over it. But the fallout of it is continuing to this day. It's still ongoing, and there's plenty to talk about. I will leave it there, though. What we see is that these tools have this sheen of objectivity, of scientific authority, and of legitimacy. They come with a promise to eliminate bias from policing and make it more productive, to provide a greater sense of security, to speed up investigations, and so on. But they run the chance of creating further problems down the road, often at the disadvantage of citizens who already fall under the police's watchful eye. So that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience as I just sort of shouted tech terms at you for the last 40 minutes. That is it.
That was awesome. Does anyone have any questions? I know I have lots, but
Sweet.
I would love to give it to the floor. So you're welcome to unmute yourself or raise your hand, whatever's easiest. I see Mark has unmuted.
Yeah, that was brilliant. That was brilliant, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
My comment, it relates to the big data story and the big data, the promise of improved everything. And they've said that big data in the health area has lagged behind other areas. But what I must say, hearing you talk, is in fact, maybe in the health area, there's been a bit more scrutiny or you need more evidence, because we're dealing with people, patients. Whereas in other areas, it's just been adopted, because what you described is exactly what we face in health. You told us all about the machine learning, the predictive models, but there's no evidence that you've shown us that it actually improves policing, or what's the data? And I'm struggling with the same area in health, where lots of studies on machine learning and predictive models, but none of them show utility. That's the word.
Yeah.
So and I congratulate you on what you're doing. That's my second question, because are you looking at this in your PhD from the policy perspective, or are you a data scientist? And the reason, because I think that to take the positive side, if you could partner with a data scientist, in other words, I can consider you a policy / clinician, and if you could partner with the data science, the algorithm generators, you could come out with, at the end, a fantastic plan or approach to actually showing how this predictive policing could in fact benefit society. Because my bias is that you got to have the two sides. You got to have the algorithm generators, the data scientists working with the clinicians, or in your sense, I call you a clinician, a policy person, to benefit society. Because I do believe that in the long run, there are opportunities for this type of technology but it's a mantra, and the whole thing we have to be very careful about. I congratulate you, and maybe you could talk, just in answering my question, where do you fit in? What are you
Where do
actually
I
doing?
fit in? No,
Are you doing?
I
Yeah,
don't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member. I am a criminologist by trade. By trade, I've never worked with my hands in my life. I am a criminologist, and I guess where that mostly fits in is the soft sciences, social sciences. I'm not a data scientist. I frankly don't understand numbers, and I never will. But I am trying to approach this in my dissertation from both the sociological side, the criminology side, as well as the tech side. There's a whole discipline, the science and technology studies, which is filled with, it's very interdisciplinary. There are lots of historians in there, science experts, policy folks as well, mostly historians, I guess. But I'm trying to merge criminology and science and technology studies to be like, here is a tech forward understanding of the different technologies that are being used in Canada, and how are they sort of adopted and governed. So there is that policy side. Maybe I'm focusing on too much, probably biting off more than I can chew. But it is, you're right in that it is a sort of blending of the tech side, the policy side, and the social.
I think you're way ahead of the game. Congratulations. Stick with it.
I appreciate that.
I see a hand up from Paul.
Yes, Dad.
Dad has a question.
Yeah.
So, I've been following your journey, obviously, for,
For about 27 years. Yeah.
a couple of weeks or so.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the difficulty you're having with getting to speak with police departments.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Why?
Why?
The question is why?
Are they hiding something, or what do
It's a
you
few
base
things.
that on?
Great question. There are a few things. What do I base it on is personal experience, unfortunately. But at least in Toronto, I have been unable to get through to the Toronto police for a few reasons. And I've tried a few avenues. The first one was I applied to conduct research with them. And that was a way to sort of say, like, I come in peace. I just want to talk to some folks behind the scenes who are involved with technology at the TPS, the Toronto Police Service. And there is a lot apparently that goes into evaluating that request. I have been in touch with someone from their strategic planning department who every now and again I'll check in and say, like, any movement on my application? And she'll go like, nope. Following up with stakeholders. The constant refrain is following up with stakeholders. There's a lot of sort of running it by legal and making sure that people can talk to me. The other avenue is the freedom of information, or ATIP, access to information, what's the word? Scheme in Canada is famously bad. The RCMP actually just got busted a few months ago for supposedly having basically with a freedom of information request is you can send in a check for $5 and a message that says, hi, police department or anyone. You can do this with any sort of government organization. Hi, like I am a researcher and I would like to know about this from this day to this day. Please provide any documents such as correspondence, research memos, whatever. That then has to go through the access to information pipeline of being considered and redacted and blah, blah, blah. All to say, it is very slow. There are certain laws governing how long the process should and can take, but oftentimes police departments go way over that deadline. And also, they don't want to give that information up, pretty much. The RCMP just got busted a few months ago for someone who sent a freedom of information request in the 90s asking about something, and they then just told him now that the request is going to take 80 years. 80 years. Like, this man will be 170 years old when that happened, or 150. Like, I can't remember how old the guy is. But all to say, this whole freedom of information process, which is a way to get information about the police with more formalized background information, is just clogged and almost deliberately difficult to navigate. We'll text more about that later if you want.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
My
Maybe you
pleasure.
need a good lawyer who can sue the police to release
Yeah.
the information.
All right. Are there any other, sorry, Misha, go ahead.
Yeah, I see Sandra has a question. Go ahead.
I have a comment to make about policing, and they want to get someone quickly. Case in point, the late David Milgaard, who passed away recently. He was innocent. They didn't have DNA at the time. He was wrongly convicted. Finally, after so many years, he was exonerated. Now there's many more people, the same thing, innocent people behind bars. What do you do about that? All ready to go?
That's a great question. And I'm not an expert on wrongful conviction, but I can definitely see how these sorts of technological decisions or these tech-based decisions can influence these sorts of wrongful convictions. There was a case of someone in, let me find the link. His name is Loomis. And it was a whole thing about when I spoke about Compass, that risk assessment tool that's used to evaluate people who are on trial for sentences, who are awaiting sentencing, to see like how long they should be sentenced for. There was someone who actually had here, his name is Eric Loomis. I'm going to post this in the chat in case anyone wants to read more about it. But it was basically like he questioned the risk, what went into the risk assessment of like why he was given such a high risk score. And they weren't able to really give him a proper answer, and it has since gone up the courts and everything. But even in that context, you can see how, here I'm posting the link to, I think that this should work. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Yeah, you can see how data and sort of algorithms that aren't fully understood can be used to make these sort of very life-changing decisions. Yeah.
I have so many questions, Daniel. So many questions, as usual. There was a little glimpse in one of your slides of a technology called ShotSpotter. Can you talk about that a little bit?
My bread and butter. ShotSpotter is a gunshot detection technology. Basically, what it involves, it's a mix of hardware and software. So the hardware are basically just microphones, very sensitive microphones that are placed either on lampposts, traffic lights, or high buildings that are then used to triangulate the sound of a gunshot. So if there are all these different microphones set up across the city, if a gun goes off at a certain place, that sound will hit all of the different microphones, and then 3 of those microphones will then be able to sort of find where it'll triangulate the sound and say, oh, the sound is coming from this area, like between these 3 microphones. Then it sends a little recording of the sound, the concussive blast. We'll call it concussive blast because it can often be a car backfiring or fireworks, to a real person in a response center in California, who then sits all day at a desk with headphones on, listening to what might be gunshots. And then they listen back to it and they go, yep, that's a gunshot, or nope, that's not a gunshot. If it is a gunshot, they then forward that information on to the closest police department. It's supposed to, I guess, like, it's wild. I think it's truly crazy. The reason I was so interested in this, and the reason I got into all of this in the first place, is because after the Danforth shooting in Toronto in 2018, sort of tied up in that conversation was like the Toronto police's attempt to get ShotSpotter. And ShotSpotter ultimately was not something that the Toronto police got, but the police really fought for it. City council kind of said, no, we don't really think we want this. Civil liberties associations thought, no, this is no good, because they were concerned that the microphones that are on the lampposts and the light fixtures and the traffic lights in the buildings can pick up conversation. Right. Now, this is not exactly true. These sounds have been, these microphones have been sort of like very carefully developed to not do that. And if they do pick up like even like a glimpse of like a very faint, it'll be almost imperceptible. But that is a sort of risk that there's a big question, which is how much sort of privacy do we want to sacrifice, let's say, for safety? And at the end of the day, the big thing about ShotSpotter is that it like doesn't work. You know, like it doesn't improve, it doesn't do the things that it says it's supposed to do, not from the technology's point of view, but from its reason for existing. It's supposed to improve response time so that police can get to an area quicker. It's supposed to help them solve crime, and it's supposed to sort of be a deterrent. You know, the city is listening, so I won't fire my gun or whatever. It doesn't do any of that, but people swear by it. So it's a fascinating technology, and I'll stop there, but that's pretty much it.
Okay, so and one of my other little questions is, you know, you're illuminating all this incredible tech software to be used in policing. Is this the same kind of software that Ukraine and Russia might be using to analyze wartime situations? Like,
so I don't know. I'm not really. So there's cyber crime and cybersecurity, and that is frankly not my my expertise. But what I do know is that there are different programs, different tools. The big one is called Pegasus. It's called spyware, and it's basically created by this company called NSO Group. Letters NSO, and it's essentially a thing that allows you to sort of like spy on people by targeting a particular phone without the person knowing. And this is a sort of thing that might be factoring into a lot of like political leaders sort of like trying to quash dissent. So maybe this is something that Russia's using. I don't want to speculate. Could be, but all to say, like there are these different tools that I'm not altogether familiar with, but that I should really be familiar with. Spyware, ransomware. Well, ransomware is different, but spyware, malware, things like that are basically used for more of these sort of like international relations or civil unrest contexts.
thank
So
you.
that's my sort of half answer.
No, it's great. Thank you.
We have time for a few more questions, so now's the time to ask away. Yeah, Heather and then Carrie.
I just wanted to know, is it as easy to manipulate an algorithm as it is to statistics, to what your point of view is?
Sorry, do you want to clarify that question?
Well, for statistics, for instance, if I tell you the air is 20% cleaner in parts per billion, it sounds like a big deal, but I mean, what really, but 20% of a 9-inch pie is significant. So you can make things sound significant when they're not, or dangerous when they're not. And then you can use it to manipulate public opinion and support, et cetera. So how easy is it to manipulate that algorithm to say, from your point of view, what should be or should not be?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, basically an algorithm is just like a process or set of rules that's used in calculations, like in problem solving. So it's difficult to know to what extent the actual algorithms themselves can be manipulated, because as I mentioned in my talk, they're proprietary. It's hard to know once they've sort of left their place of origin. It's difficult to get into their guts and sort of see how they work. So it's hard to say how they can be manipulated. However, there are a lot of human decisions that predate the creation of these algorithms, right? And I think what maybe this kind of gets at your question, people make algorithms. Like a human beings designed compass, that risk evaluation that assigns a risk score that'll then influence sentencing. People are deciding like what quality in a human being has the most weight that will determine whether or not they're going to reoffend or not, or whether they're a risk. And not all the time, but a lot of the time, a lot of these decisions are made by, with all due respect, like computer engineers who don't necessarily have the deepest grasp of like more complex social problems. And this was the thing about those like that I mentioned at the end about, sorry, I recognize it's noon, so I don't want to keep anyone, but what I mentioned at the end about facial recognition, a lot of those facial recognition tools simply could not, I had a very bad error rate with identifying people of color, because those facial recognition algorithms had been trained on just white people, right? And a human made that decision to input that data in there or whatever. So it's almost like, it's hard to say how much they can be manipulated after the fact, but there is a sort of influence, like a human influence that can sort of skew how they sort of play out in practice.
So that would lead me to asking, how much can we trust the algorithms that we're basing these decisions on?
I mean, that's what I'm trying to, that's my talk. I want you to sort of be skeptical of them. You know, they have this sort of veneer of truth and objectivity because we're sort of like conditioned to believe that the numbers don't lie, the computer said so, you know. What I'm trying to say is, what if we questioned what the computer said?
Daniel, could I answer her question? I think
go for it, Mark.
Heather, one point you alluded to classical statistics versus algorithms. In fact, first, statistics can lie too. So they both can lie.
That was my point.
They both can lie.
Yes.
The other thing to understand is statistics is based on a hypothesis that you prove yes or no. Machine learning or algorithms are based on no a priori hypothesis. You look at reams of data and you let the computer explore, and it's post hoc looking at the data, and you develop insights. And there's a big controversy if you take a data set and you use classical statistics or machine learning and you compare the two. Sometimes they agree and sometimes they don't agree. And just as Daniel, and that's a big field of research, a big field. Just to answer the question, can I give you an anecdote just to from health, but very similar to you. We put a grant in not too long ago to use the facial recognition technology or artificial intelligence to assess whether after you've treated a person with breast cancer with surgery or radiation, is it good? Does it cosmetically look good? And we wanted to use machine learning. We had all sorts of photographs, stuff like that. And we didn't get the grant. We got a good score. But one of the comments was, well, what about Black people? And me, the clinician, said, oh my God, that's related to some of the whole politics right now of going on with social, equity, diversity, stuff like that. But the artificial intelligence, the data scientist I was working with said, no, has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the facial the technology, that it was, how do you know that it's not been built, the algorithms, on white anatomy? People with white skin, white breasts, stuff like that. How do you know it's going to work? So it's it was very similar to the whole story of facial recognition in Black people. So it cuts across what you've talked about, I think, cuts across all sorts of domains.
Daniel, if you're okay to wait another few minutes, Carrie, if you want to ask your question, and then we'll wrap up just to get everyone's burning questions out.
Well, Daniel, really, actually, the last kind of exchange covered a lot of what I was hoping to ask you to talk about. But really, I just wanted to say thank you for doing such a fantastic job. And especially, I think you really nailed it when you were able to explain why it's important that we unpair this concept of algorithms with impartiality, because they aren't. And I think you just really did a spectacular job of sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate it. If anyone knows anyone at the Toronto Police or Hamilton Police, please slip my information, slip their information to the cantor and the rabbi. That would be killer.
Awesome. We'll try and dig in to get all that info for you.
Don't hurt yourself. Don't worry about it. That's fine. I shouldn't have.
Well, sadly, this talk has now come to an end, but it was so incredible to hear it. I was very excited for this one. This is an area I'm super interested in. So it was great. And thank you so much for taking the time on this Sunday morning / afternoon to chat with us. And so I'll do a little plug for our last talk next week. Next week, we're welcoming Ben Krieger, and he's going to be our final next generation talk. And he is a rocket scientist. So stay tuned, come to that.
Please.
Uh,
Right.
It'll be
CNN
really
Sunday.
great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
This
Thank
is
you
not
so
rocket
much.
science.
And have a great week, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Enjoy the long weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Good to see you too. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.